Get started here. So this class today is on substantial damage and substantial improvement. These are concepts that are part of participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, and substantial damage applies in the case of disaster. We'll get into those details. And substantial improvement is a closely associated concept or closely linked concept, which functions essentially the same way as substantial damage, that is always in effect through your management of the floodplain. We're going to go over welcoming and introductions. We're going to talk about those concepts. We're going to talk about how to be prepared in a disaster setting, or prior to a disaster, and in the context of, I guess. And then the substantial damage assessment process. We'll get into the steps, how to do that efficiently and strategically in the case of a disaster affecting your community. Elijah, my colleague, is going to run us through an exercise demonstrating the free FEMA software that we recommend communities utilize. We understand there's other software out there, but this one is free and very accessible to communities, so it's the one we focus on. And then we've got some comments at the end about substantial improvement and some other items. Oh, so shoot, this didn't get updated, but today our presenters are myself, Adele Phillips. I'm the flood mitigation planner at the Department of Natural Resources. I help on grant administration side of things, specifically on the topic of mitigation. And I collaborate closely with Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, as well as other stakeholders in that mitigation realm. I also work with NFIP communities on day-to-day implementation of our floodplain management regulations. And then I'll let you introduce yourself, Elijah, and who's filling in for Chuck today due to illness.
Yeah, thanks, Adele. Sorry, we didn't update the slide here. I think maybe some saving issues occurred, but my name is Elijah Kaufman. I'm an environmental specialist here with Nebraska DNR. My email is formatted the same way as Adele's and Chuck's, with first and last name at nebraska.gov. But yeah, I basically I kind of fill in a lot of roles here at DNR, primarily with ordinance reviews and passing new ordinances. So if your community has recently passed a new ordinance, you've likely spoken with me. And if you do so in the future, you will likely speak with me. But it's great to meet everyone, and I look forward to providing a great class today.
Thank you, Elijah. And I should add, our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so you'll get to see it there. Okay, so the first part of this presentation, this 2-hour class, is going to be about the guidance and procedures we have in a handbook that we released last year that is intended to be a manual for Nebraska communities to correctly implement substantial damage and substantial improvement procedures. The second part of this training is going to be a live demonstration of the software. So we'll get into the text heavy stuff first. The substantial improvement, substantial damage. We've got the definition on the right-hand side of your screen of substantial damage. It means damage of any origin sustained by an obstruction or structure, whereby the cost of restoring the obstruction to its before damaged condition would equal or exceed 50% of the market value of the obstruction before the damage occurred. This any origin is highlighted because we're going to be talking a lot about flood here, and we are floodplain managers, but the damage does not have to be inflicted by a flood in order for these procedures to be triggered by these regulations. So remember that if it's a hailstorm, straight line windstorm, thunderstorm, tornado, wildfire, structure fire, and a flood, you're going to need to implement this procedure. When a structure is damaged in the floodplain, repairs to that structure can be permitted. The thing is that they need to be permitted according or in compliance with the rule about substantial damage. When the level of damage is minor or superficial, it's a quick and easy permitting process, and it's a fairly simple evaluation. But once that total cost of repair moves beyond half of that structure's value, then you've shifted into a substantial damage determination, and certain requirements apply. We'll explain this throughout this whole training. So when you have a disaster, going more into those post-disaster, a property owner wants to repair their home immediately, get back to normal, and those repairs can be permitted. They need to be permitted, just like any development in the flood hazard, special flood hazard area or floodplain. To identify whether that amount of repair, and sometimes it's an improvement like a home addition that also occurs, whether that falls above or below that 50% threshold, that's where a substantial damage assessment comes into play. That's the official procedure for having a consistent determination about substantial damage. So we're going to talk about that process in detail today. And the first phase of it is being prepared before a disaster. We know that in the case of flooding anyway, it's going to happen. We know that our floodplains are inherently hazardous places. We know that in Nebraska, flooding is the most frequently reported hazard in Nebraska. We know that in a 30-year mortgage for a home in the floodplain, there's a better than 1 in 4 chance of that structure experiencing a flood. We also know that climate models are showing that Nebraska is getting wetter, particularly in the spring. We are experiencing more rainfall. And not only are we experiencing more rainfall, we're experiencing a greater frequency in storms. We're experiencing greater scale and intensity. Intensity would mean more water falling over a shorter time. So we're more likely to overwhelm our drainage systems. And then we're also experiencing a decrease in predictability and forecasting capabilities. There's amazing science around forecasting, but our models are becoming more irregular, or our weather patterns are becoming more irregular. So our ability to predict is going to struggle to keep up with the changes. So it pays to be prepared. Now, like I mentioned before, we have a new guide. It was released in March of last year. It's always available on our website in our digital desk reference location. Michelle has put a link to this resource in the chat. There you'll be able to access the PDF, and if you'd like, you can follow along in the handbook document as this presentation continues. I have the page numbers noted at the bottom of the slides, so you can advance through the PDF if you'd like. And I apologize, I'm very congested, so I might start to sound out of breath. And if you have trouble hearing me, it's because I'm congested. So once you've gone to the digital desk reference via that link, you'll see these two menus. The first bar, if you click on that, you get the full substantial damage assessment handbook. If you click on the second one, you'll be able to get to all the items that are in the appendices. We've got lots of template materials such template letters, template worksheets, checklists, all the immediate needs that a floodplain administrator will have in implementing this process. Okay, so substantial damage assessment. What we want to start with are the sunny day activities. These are the activities you can do before disaster happens or in a non-disaster setting. We know we've identified that flooding is going to happen. So it makes sense for you when at any time in which there's, not a disaster going on, anytime it's prudent for you to set up the procedures and records in place that we're going to talk about today. It's a worthwhile investment of your time. We understand that, as a floodplain administrator, you are focused on properties within the floodplain, but your duty as a community official, you probably have many other hats that you're wearing. We understand that, and that's why we've made this guide to help streamline things. But just to clarify, the guidance today is regarding floodplain regulations. Okay, pre-disaster planning. This is part of the sunny day work. What you need to do is basically identify your regulatory jurisdiction. What is the area you're responsible for implementing this procedure within? And within that area, you need to identify the structures that are at risk. These are structures that would be subject to the substantial damage assessment. From there, once you've identified those structures, you can build a database. This can be a spreadsheet at first, and it can be easily migrated into the software tool we'll demonstrate. In addition, you can come up with, we recommend you build a plan. And this is a plan for basic actions in case of disaster. Have that plan outlined beforehand. So in these next slides, I'll go into more detail. Knowing your jurisdiction. In this diagram, we have a dashed line representing a jurisdictional boundary. For many of you, that's going to be your community's legal limits plus the extraterritorial jurisdiction, maybe an additional 1 mile or 2 mile sort of buffer around your legal limits. Within this area, we have a shaded blue zone that is representative of the floodplain. This is the special flood hazard area. There's probably, it'll extend beyond your jurisdiction and to varying degrees be within your jurisdiction. Now, the other area we have described in this diagram, and this is on page 11 in that handbook, we have this yellow hatched area. This represents the area that's been impacted by disaster. So we've got these 3 zones overlaid, essentially. Now, let's look at these structures. The first one is, it's within that dashed line, it's in the jurisdiction, but it's not impacted by the disaster. You don't need to worry about it. The second house, you've got it in your jurisdiction. It is impacted by the disaster, but it is not in the special flood hazard area. So today's guidance doesn't apply to this house because we're only dealing with structures in the floodplain. House 3, we'll move on next. It is in your jurisdiction. It is not impacted by the disaster area, but it is in the special flood hazard area. So these regulations apply, but you won't have to implement them just yet on this house because it's not affected. Whereas with house 4, it's in the jurisdiction, it's in the floodplain, and it's in the disaster area. So this would be something in which you would have to implement the full substantial damage assessment consideration. House 5, it's damaged, it's floodplain, but it is outside of your jurisdiction. So it's subject to these regulations, but you are not the floodplain administrator responsible for this structure. It's the neighboring jurisdiction's responsibility. You may have a mutual aid agreement between your jurisdictions. So you might end up helping them with that structure, but it's not your obligation as the floodplain administrator for the community here on the left. The sixth house, again, it's out of the jurisdiction. It's not in the special flood hazard area. It is impacted, but because it's not in your jurisdiction, it's not your responsibility. And because it's not in the special flood hazard area, it's not subject to these requirements. At this point in time, I think probably most folks are familiar with the Map Service Center. If you're not, feel free to raise your hand. We can provide more details to you directly. This is FEMA's mapping portal. It's where you can find all kinds of records, historical flood insurance rate maps, your letters of map amendment, letters of map revision, paper flood insurance rate maps, and also for those digitally mapped, you can get a format or a digital print of your floodplain of a select area. Okay, Dan, looks like you are not familiar with this tool. Michelle has put a link in there and you can access it and explore it. When you do, if you look up your community, if you want to see the full history, you're going to want to click this search all products link before you enter your address here. Click search all products, then enter the state and your county and jurisdiction name in the menu that comes up next. And you'll be able to see all those documents that are related to your jurisdiction specifically. Now, a handier tool, we think, a DNR, probably because it's our tool, is our online interactive map. And Michelle's going to put another link to that here in the chat. This is our GIS platform. It's web-based. It's got a whole bunch of functionality built in, and I've got a couple screenshots coming up here. When you initially access that link, oh, and I should point out that there's a tile, an image down towards the bottom of our floodplain management section website where you can click and it'll take you to this GIS portal. There'll be a splash page that asks for your consent and an acknowledgement, and then you click continue to go through this splash page. Then once you're in the map, you can quickly search by your community name, or you can search by the section, township, and range number if you've got the public land survey system as the closest legal description for the area of your inquiry. And of course, there's plus and minus over here in the left-hand corner of the screen for you to zoom in now, and the wheel button on your mouse will get you there. As you zoom into the map, layers, more detailed layers become visible. When in the default setting on this map, as it loads, it is going to have all potential map layers activated. So in some areas of the state, if you have a mapping project going on right now where they are identifying the latest flood hazard areas, there's going to be multiple layers that could show up, and it could be confusing. Here we've got a screenshot of an area where we've got preliminary or pending maps, as well as the current regulatory maps, and it's all a bit jumbled. If you want to see regulatory floodplain only, turn off the flood awareness areas, the preliminary NFHL layers, and the pending NFHL layers. This national flood hazard layer, this is your regulatory floodplain. For those of you who have paper maps, you're going to see something a little different. This is mostly in the central and western part of the state. You're going to see a raster overlaid, and it'll look like white dots. In that case, we recommend that you use your paper maps, although the interactive map gives you the gist of where the floodplain is, but your paper maps are the better tool there. So anyway, if you've got all those layers, just turn off these three that have the little pink dots on them. Now, like I said, the National Flood Hazard Layer is regulatory. You need to concern yourself with the blue shaded and red hatched areas, if you have them in your map. This is the area where this substantial damage and substantial improvement regulations apply. And if you look in your local ordinance, you'll see that those two terms are defined, but it applies in these areas. It doesn't apply in areas such as the orange and shaded here. That's they're areas removed from floodplain by the presence of a levee. But again, you need this National Flood Hazard Layer turned on. Okay, for smaller communities, like I mentioned, the extraterritorial jurisdiction exists. It is your responsibility to implement floodplain management ordinance within your extraterritorial jurisdiction. There may be other things in that extraterritorial jurisdiction that are part of the county's responsibility, but with regards to floodplain management, the extraterritorial jurisdiction is your responsibility. We've got a screenshot or a snap here of 4 different communities. You'll see that Village of Lushton, at least at the time of this screenshot being captured, does not have an extraterritorial jurisdiction. So their floodplain management obligation would only be within this legal limits that's described. Some extraterritorial jurisdictions are orthogonal, or they're rectilinear and follow generally property boundaries. Others are a radial buffer, such as Grafton and Fairmont down here. If your extraterritorial jurisdiction changes, or if your community annexes property and your legal limits change, please let us know. These boundaries are what is reported to us. So it's up to the community to make sure it's up to date and provide us with a description as to changes that have occurred and revisions that need to happen. Continuing on with this jurisdictional theme, here we have Prosser. Prosser is in Adams County, the south. Hall County is to the north. This house, or this acreage, that's within the special flood hazard area, the blue shaded area, is in the floodplain, and it's the jurisdiction of Prosser in this case, even though it's in a different county, but it's within the extraterritorial jurisdiction of Prosser. So it's Prosser's responsibility to implement the floodplain management ordinance should this house sustain any damage from some form of disaster. So please understand your jurisdictional responsibilities. If you have questions, reach out to us at any time. Again, if you have new maps, going back to those other layers that you might see, and new maps are communities that would have a flood awareness area showing, or a preliminary or pending NFHL layer. You might want to be aware of this future shift in your floodplain boundary and plan ahead. Identify structures that are, previously were not in your floodplain, but now are likely going to become part of the floodplain. to isolate those layers, just turn off affected paper maps and the NFHL. Okay, so going back, identifying the structures. We've identified the territory. Now, you're going to have parcels in that territory that have no structures on them. You don't need to do substantial damage assessment on that because there's no structure. But you do need to be aware of the properties that have structures on them. This can be pretty daunting if you don't already have an inventory of structures in your jurisdiction. Luckily, we have very robust GIS-based assessor records across the state. What we recommend you do is, as part of the sunny day period, create a property record inventory. This is the foundation of establishing the records for your substantial damage estimator tool. This is the Substantial Damage Estimator 3.0 is the software that we're presenting today that FEMA and we recommend you utilize to implement this process consistently. So we have a whole wealth of information in GIS systems these days, and through those assessor records. If your county utilizes GIS, a GIS consultant, and you don't have a person on staff that can do this, it's a very quick procedure in the software. You can contact that consultant and make a work request to them where you are seeking the properties that are located within or intersect with the 1% annual chance floodplain. And they may ask for a shapefile, but they probably already have one of your community. Anyway, they will do a selection process, which will pull the data for all those parcels that intersect with that floodplain. And the software will quickly generate a table, which can be exported as a spreadsheet in an Excel file, actually, that can then be passed to you. This process takes minutes at most. So it's very fast, not a heavy lift, and it will generate you a list of parcels and a variety of information associated with those parcels. You may need to sort through that data and find out which properties have no structures, because those ones you won't need to worry about implementing the substantial damage assessment process. Okay, when you are building this record of structures in your floodplain, there's some information that you want to make sure you have. You need to make sure you've got the following owner information: their first and last name, their telephone number, the basic contact information, community name. This is important if you're a county, because you will have different villages and cities named as part of that address. The zip code, the official structure address. Note that a structure address is different than a mailing address. They are often different. And the structure address is different than an owner's mailing address. The owner may not live on site, or maybe they're a box holder at the post office. So you need to know that structure address, as well as the contact information. If you're a community like Prosser and you've got structures in multiple counties, you're going to make sure you want that county name as well, as part of each record. And then, of course, the lot and parcel number. And the parcel, it could be your accessible parcel number, or maybe you have a different kind of parcel numbering system. Have that. Also have the lot description. If it's part of a subdivision, have that full subdivision name and block and lot number information included. Now, with regard to the structure, this is all foundational information that's going to help, that's going to allow the substantial damage estimator tool to create an accurate substantial damage result for for you. For the structure, you need to know the year it was built, the type and number of units on the property. Maybe it's a multi-family structure. You're going to need to know if it's an 8-plex or 4-plex. You need to know the habitable area per that structure in square feet, as well as the use of the structure. Again, that's commercial, residential, multifamily level of use. The number of stories, the type of construction, is it masonry or is it stick built? Foundation type, exterior material type, vinyl siding, brick veneer, whether the garage is attached, detached. It's especially helpful if you can get the photos downloaded from the assessor. It's great to have a before photo for reference when you're evaluating damage that has occurred or modifications that have been made to a structure. If you've got that before picture available, it will really help provide some clarity. And then, of course, the adjusted tax assessed value of the structure. We recommend using that as a baseline for evaluation in the substantial damage estimator tool and use it consistently across the board. I should note here that this information is, when you use the substantial damage estimator tool, it's not putting these records up in the cloud somewhere. It's a software that gets installed on the community official's computer, and that data only lives locally where the software is installed. So the records that you're creating and the information that you're gathering here is secure on that computer, or is as secure as that computer is secure. So if your community is careful about managing this kind of data, then you should be fine. The software itself doesn't have any capacity to be, you're not going to be inadvertently releasing this data more broadly. It's there stored locally on that computer in which this program is installed. It's not going to go elsewhere. Okay, so that's the basics on the data that you need to start building your record or your inventory. And Elijah's going to show you how that data gets put into the software tool. So you don't need to worry about that at this time. We're just telling you where you can get that data. Okay, and the next thing is create a post-disaster plan. So before the disaster, have a plan for what you're going to do if a disaster occurs. And there's a great deal of level of detail in the handbook on page 12 describing each of these, but and we recommend that you work with your emergency manager on this. You probably have an emergency management plan from which this post-disaster plan can build. This does not need to be a formal or extensive document. It can be a couple pages at most, outline format. But the idea is that you've got these things pinned down. So, you've got some notes together and a skeleton of what needs to happen available for you to share with others when in time of disaster. So in disaster response. So a little bit more about each of these. For meeting locations, you need to know where your team or the other officials that you're working with are going to get together. Sometimes it's the community buildings that are impacted by the disaster and they aren't available. So you can't always assume that they will be available in disaster response setting. So make sure you have primary and backup locations for meeting and operations. Identify staff members that will be helping with this effort. It may be that maintenance staff, fire, police, utilities or roads personnel are your colleagues in this effort. These individuals, they like you, they probably know the community very well, and can be effective in mapping and assessing the damage. If you're a small community, you might consider teaming up with an adjacent community for the purpose of fulfilling these duties. Again, I mentioned those interlocal agreements where you share your resources, your personnel resources. Staff responsibilities, make sure you've got an idea of who's going to be doing what. Some examples of things to assign or have an idea of: who would be doing the substantial damage inspections, who would be doing public notice or media releases, who's going to be running the data processing on the substantial damage estimator tool. Is there somebody that's going to be doing quality control of the substantial damage reports? And also, who's going to be handling the permit flow, permit applications coming in, being reviewed, being issued. Emergency routes. You're going to need to know which evacuation routes are likely available, which roads may be threatened by floodwaters and likely inaccessible. Have a list of contacts. Make sure you have multiple ways or redundancy of ways to get a hold of others, not just email, not just only a phone number, but have a few means of contact for officials and anyone who might be assisting in the effort. I see I got a direct comment from Jeff. He states, "I'm assuming DNR will be sending a copy of this PowerPoint." Yes, we will. There will be a follow-up. Okay, there are some other things on. Plan for notification. Identify if it's radio, newspaper, social media, some other avenue that's available to your community to get the word out, because there's going to be a lot of information that needs to be conveyed. There's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of repeat questions. If you can get consistent answers out to everyone, that will help you. And then you're going to need substantial damage assessment resources, such as the handbook that we're going over today, as well as FEMA guides and fieldwork tools. Luckily, you don't have to think of everything. We've got checklists in the back of the handbook. This is the pre and post disaster planning checklist. There's a note here up at the top. So items 1 through 12 may all be completed prior to a disaster occurring. So these are the sunny day things you can do. Those items 1 through 12. You don't have to keep it all up in here or remember it from scratch. Just find the checklist at the back of our handbook. This also appears in the FEMA substantial improvement, substantial damage desk reference, this checklist. We have a second checklist. That's your field supplies. So it's got great advice as to the items you should have with you and in these inspection teams, so that they are well equipped. And so you don't have to think of everything yourself. And you'll notice on this screenshot, there's this violet or lavender shading. That's because these are fillable PDFs. If you access these documents via a tablet, a laptop tablet, or computer, you can activate these check boxes digitally. You can fill in the note fields digitally, or you can also just print them out and complete them manually. Okay, now we're going to shift to disaster has happened. What do you do? We were in the pre-disaster stuff you can do. and should do. And now we're going to be in the after disaster, what you have to do phase. As I stated, the repairs are subject to floodplain development permitting requirements, and there's this threshold of 50%. I don't know if there are any communities in here that have adopted different damage thresholds. It is possible for a community to identify and adopt a lower threshold, something lower than 50%. Today, we're just talking about 50% because it's common and standard, but do note your community may be special and have adopted something less than that. So to really identify where that, if it's above or below 50%, it's not a gut decision. It's based on data gathered in a field and run through the software and through this process called a substantial damage assessment. We have in the handbook on page 22 a helpful flowchart decision tree that lets you know when you really need to do a substantial damage assessment. Thinking back to that chart we saw earlier, or the diagram with the different overlapping layers of jurisdiction, floodplain, disaster area, and then the little houses. Now you've found a house, but there's still further identification we can go through. And I hope everyone can see we've got a green arrow for yes and sort of pink red for no in this flow chart. So once you've identified that the damage structure is in the special flood hazard area, we'll ask, does the structure meet your floodplain management ordinance standards? Meaning, was it built after the flood insurance rate map was adopted or prior to it? If it was built after the flood insurance rate map was adopted, and there's a permit record for the structure. No, if it's built without a permit, it's a violation. That's a different issue. But if it's built with a floodplain permit after the flood insurance rate map is adopted, then you can repair, or you can issue a permit for repairs to that structure. No problem. You don't have to do this substantial damage assessment, and they can repair the structure to its pre-disaster state, no matter the percentage of damage. Again, repair to pre-disaster state, no matter the percentage of damage. Now, if they want to build an addition, that's a separate matter. But if they just want to rebuild the structure as is, it doesn't matter if it was 75% damage, they can do it because it was built to code and they are going to be rebuilding it to code. Now, if the structure predates your current floodplain management ordinance, then the substantial damage inspection of the structure is going to be required, and damage determination percentage is going to need to be identified using the substantial damage estimator tool. So you've got to go through that process. Now, is the structure substantially damaged? If it's 50% up, then yes, permits are required. If it's not, permits are required, but they can repair it to, it doesn't have to be brought into compliance with, it can be repaired to previous, not brought into compliance with the current floodplain management order. It still requires a permit, but you just attach that substantial damage determination that demonstrates it was below 50%, and that's all the record keeping you need. Now, if it is substantially damaged, then it's still going to require permits to rebuild, but that new structure, that new development must be brought into compliance with your current floodplain management ordinance. Typically, that means the lowest floor is going to need to be above the base flood elevation by 1 foot, and that previously it wasn't. That's the common situation here. Rarely, but sometimes we find that the structure was a residence in a floodway, and it's not allowed, it's prohibited to have a habitable structure in the floodway. So a property owner seeking to permit repairs and bring that structure into compliance again with the floodplain management ordinance cannot, because it's not allowed to have a habitable structure in the floodway, which is logical because the floodway is the area of greatest flood hazard. It's imprudent to have people living in such a high hazard zone. And we are all universally concerned about the health and safety of our community members. So please note that in that case, it's just not possible to continue that use in that zone. But anyway, that aside, so permits are required. Rebuilding the substantial damage structure equals new construction, and the new construction needs to be built to code. And then we have the note about floodway here. Okay, now, so this flow chart exists in your handbook in the back as a appendix item that you can copy easily, and it's also in the body of the handbook on page 22. It's a great resource. Now, next, you've got your sunny day activities, you've got the database, you know your jurisdiction and everything. A disaster has occurred. What do you do about that field work? How do you do it? Well, in our handbook, we've got it broken down into 6 steps, and step 3 has 4 different subcomponents. But we've got 6 steps outlined for you that you can follow to map out your procedure as efficiently and strategically as possible. And a really helpful thing to know here is that if this is a federally declared disaster, it's in your community's interest to keep track of your staff time spent implementing this procedure, because you can be reimbursed for those hours. So keep records of these efforts. You will be able to get money back from them. Okay, before you go out into the field, you're going to do some office work. First thing first, identify the stuff you don't need to worry about. You do not need to worry about damaged areas that are outside of the special flood hazard area. Again, this process doesn't apply. You don't need to worry about areas of the special flood hazard area not impacted by the disaster. We have floodplain boundaries outlined on a map. When a flood happens, it's not going to perfectly match those flood boundaries. Sometimes you'll have flooding outside of the special flood hazard area. You don't have to worry about those structures. Sometimes you'll have flooding, and you're flooding only in part of your special flood hazard area. You do need to worry about that, but you don't have to look at those other structures that are in your special flood hazard area but not impacted by the flood, if the flood is the disaster in this case. So be aware of that. Don't identify those things you don't have to worry about. And then, of course, the structures in compliance with the current floodplain ordinance. You just don't have to worry about them. You don't have to do the substantial damage assessment process on those structures. So find those savings. You're going to need to do immediate outreach. Let other community officials know about this required procedure, and also let the public know about this. There's likely going to, if it's a major disaster, there may be a public information officer assigned. They'll be responsible for the social media platform. There'll also be a primary point of contact for emergency response personnel. You can feed them information and they can feed it to other people. And then also provide press releases to radio and newspaper about this. Parts of our communities are very in tune with social media and plugged in, but others, are community members, rely on radio and newspaper. So don't forget about those platforms. They are effective And sometimes when a major disaster happens, broadband access is wiped out. So have redundancy in your means of communication. Additionally, these are the things the public needs to know. They need to know that an inspection of their property needs to happen before they start repairing their work. They need to get a permit before they start repairing their work. If they start doing repairs without permit, technically it's a violation of your floodplain management ordinance. Let them know what activities do require a permit. Development in the floodplain includes earthwork, cut, fill. It's in addition to structure. It includes road and bridge infrastructure as well. So make sure you've got that information out there. Certain amounts of vegetation clearing are subject to permit, but not all vegetation clearing. There's also, of course, the substantial damage requirement that needs to be communicated about. For some folks with flood insurance policies, they may qualify for additional financial support through increased cost of compliance. There's some flyers about this through FEMA's website that you could include as well with your outreach. You might want to caution your community about unlicensed contractors or fraudulent entities that come into town. I think we've all seen after a windstorm that a whole bunch of kind of roofing contractor signs will pop up. There's a lot of fly-by-night sort of outfits that will show up in communities. But in your part of your permitting procedure, you can be asking for that contractor's license numbers, and you can check those. But also just give your public a heads up so that they don't get into agreement with a company that's going to take advantage of them. You might also want to talk about mitigation opportunities. Maybe there's some simple home improvements that could be done, such as like putting a backflow prevention device while other improvements are being made. One thing you can do is, instead of waiting for a disaster to happen and having to put all this information out there, you can share this information on an annual basis. Once a year, put it in with a utility newsletter. Just have a date on the calendar or a month where you always get this floodplain information out to the relevant parties, just en masse. Now, there's going to be a lot of inspections that occur, I guess inspections isn't the right word, but assessments, evaluative activities to scope damage. We've got several here. Rapid needs assessment. This is for determining the scope of federal involvement in supporting a state response to a disaster. It's the one that happens pretty immediately, within hours after a large emergency. Then there's preliminary damage assessment. And this is part of the damage declaration process. It's conducted by federal and local representatives. The information gathered describes the impact as a whole and is shared with the governor of Nebraska and NEMA, Nebraska Emergency Management Agency, to determine the type and amount of assistance needed. There's also going to be damage assessment. This is, again, about scoping the scale of loss, and it evaluates structural loss. Structures will get flagged as destroyed, major, minor, affected. This is different than the substantial damage assessment. I have an asterisk by substantial damage assessment and damage assessment because With planning, you could do these together. The important thing, though, is that you get the right information so that you can complete the substantial damage assessment. In the damage assessment, not as much data needs to be gathered as is gathered for the substantial damage assessment. So make sure it's clear what is needed on the special flood hazard area structures for that substantial damage assessment requirement. Okay, let's do a poll here. And it says substantial damage assessments must be done on all damaged structures, even those outside the special flood hazard area. Okay, I think we can. Looks like most have answered. All right, you're a great class. Yes, the answer is false. That's kind of confusing, isn't it? The answer is false. You do not need to do a substantial damage assessment on all structures. Okay, we've got, I think I've got about less than 10 more minutes of material here. I'll try to go through it a little quicker. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll pivot to the software. The nuts and bolts of the substantial damage assessment are, you're going to do after that office organization, letting the others know, the public information officer and other officials and the public know about this requirement. You're going to do a curbside review. This is where you drive through the area and you determine the area that you're going to need to do a finer scale substantial damage assessment within. You need to know the boundaries of this disaster area and where they overlap with your special flood hazard area. Take printed maps with you and draw on those maps where the boundary exists. Cross off houses that are cleared outside the damage area. Make notes, draw on those maps, hold on to these maps. But these will help you strategize how you spend your time in the field later. It might feel like an extra step, but this is going to save you time. So you're going to get a count of structures. You're going to get an idea as to the type of structures. Are they modular homes or maybe a gated community? Do a rough estimate of levels of damage and identify any health and safety issues. Know which structures do not look safe to enter. Identify if maybe there's some septic or sewer leakage issues. You do not want to be in those areas. You don't want your staff to be in those areas until they're safe. There may also be water over the road or just places that are impassable. So note access issues. It might be that the road is closed or bridge is out, or it could also be it's a gated community and you need to get a code to go in. In the case of flooding, note the depth of flooding above the first floor. It can be increments of ½ foot. You don't need to be more precise than that. Have an idea of the duration of flooding. Have 4 days pass and there's still standing water there. Note that. But if the flooding was over and the water was gone in 6 hours, note that, because that all plays into that calculation of substantial damage. And take photos on this initial pass of what you see. This will help you. You may think at the outset, I'm going to remember this, but once you've driven all these roads, things are going to blur together. Take some photos to capture some key points to help you strategize later. So once you've done that curbside review, then you come back to the office and you're going to come up with a schedule. This is your substantial damage inspection schedule. And this is where you initiate the substantial damage assessment process. We've got it broken into 4 phases. So the first part is a schedule. You know, you can prioritize areas in different ways. Areas with no damage or very little damage. This is an area where you can issue a lot of permits quickly to people so they can get back to work. Identify areas where debris and contents have been removed from the structure already. Those will be fast inspections also. Areas with critical facilities might be a community priority. So do those first so they can be operational or start their repairs as well, and provide services to the community that are necessary. If you've got areas with a high density of development and mini structures, those are good places to target, because if you're in an urban setting, you can have, and you've got a 2-inspector team. If it's a dense enough area where they can walk from structure to structure, they can evaluate 20 to 35 structures per day as your estimate for what could be accomplished. And then notice those areas that have temporary or permanent access issues. Debris could be a temporary issue. Permanent might, like a gate, might take longer. So know that might be a bottleneck that needs addressing. Okay, and also you're going to let the public again know that you are going out on inspection. Let the fire, the police, and emergency management folks also know that you're going out and doing these inspections. Let them know where you're going to be and at what times. Inspectors should carry personal IDs and letters of introduction from local officials. You're there on official business. Property owners are going to be rightfully concerned if people they don't know are showing up on their property. So be professional and bring your credentials with you. And before you set your teams out in the field, you're going to want to do something called pilot inspections. This is everyone together looking at an example property or two and familiarizing the field inspectors with the worksheets that we have copies of in the back of the handbook, as well as the tool itself. If your inspectors know where this data is going, they'll be more blanking on a word, just aware of its use and its importance, and make sure to get it when they're in the field. So demonstrate that tool to the inspectors. And these first pilot inspections, right out the gate, you're already doing work. You're already completing that substantial damage assessment lift. Because you're not going to be doing this in houses that aren't damaged. These are ones where you wouldn't need to do this inspection anyway, but these ones were a teaching tool and will allow your teams to be more consistent when they're out in the field. Okay, and then actually conducting the substantial damage inspections. Okay, remember, when you're performing an inspection, you are in somebody's home or business. You need to make sure that the inspector needs to make sure that they verify that they have permission and take appropriate care and respect for the structure and the contents. Maintain a consistent and unbiased presence in these spaces, and try to have a consistent procedure in all structures. Maybe you always start in the kitchen, or you always find the utility room first and then move in a clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. This will help you make sure that you don't overlook any rooms or damage if you get that pattern. And of course, utilize the worksheets and the guides in the handbook for consistency. This is, I showed you back at the side in that digital desk reference that we showed you earlier. If you expand this menu, you will see this list of PDFs that you can download. And these are also already in that handbook. But there's the worksheet templates, and there's exterior and interior inspection guides. These are single pages that prompt you as to what you should look for when you are inside and outside the structure. We also have percent damage estimation tables. These are damage ranges 0 to 25%, 25 to 50%, and descriptions of the type of damage you would see in that level or in that range for the foundation, for the superstructure, for the roof cladding, for the siding, for flooring, for cabinetry. They are limited to a flood scenario of a single story structure though. So know that these percentage tables are for a specific setting. They wouldn't be applicable in a fire setting, for example.